All right, looks like we are live. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another series in our weekly Adams County Historical Society program series. Welcome. My name is Abby Huffman. I'm the Director of Programs here with the Adams County Historical Society. And for those of you that don't know, ACHS is centered right in the heart of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And here we have a house of over 1 million artifacts, and we try to preserve not only the history of Adams County, but the history of the people of Adams County. And currently we are working on a new museum, which is going to be just north of town. So if you haven't heard, we're going to be having a great opening of that, hopefully sometime next year. And we are excited to have you all here with us tonight as we kind of get ready for that project there. Now, because we do have a project going on, we are, of course, trying to make this programming free to the public and make it all possible. So if you would like, there is a red heart donate button. You are welcome to press it anytime during the program. Helps us keep our programs accessible and free to the public. And at the same time, helps us get ready to have a new museum and event center to be able to share with everyone. So with that, I, of course, would like to, again, welcome you all here this evening. I'm going to introduce our speaker for tonight, who's going to be speaking on Too Much for Human Endurance, the George Spangler Farm Hospital, and the Battle of Gettysburg. And he's actually one of a dear friends of mine, Ron Kirkwood. So first of all, Ron, welcome. Thanks for coming tonight. Ron Kirkwood is the author of Too Much for Human Endurance, which I will tell you right now is one of the best books released in 2019. And it was published through Savas Beatty. And it's gone through hardcover and softcover and audio, I believe. So you can get a chance to get it in many different formats when it's not sold out. He is a very popular author around here. And he argues that the George Spangler farm was the most important farm in the Battle of Gettysburg story. And in his book, he reveals factors that have been overlooked for generations. So I think you're going to get a new perspective here tonight. Ron Kirkwood is retired after a 40-year career as an editor and writer in newspapers and magazines, including USA Today, the Baltimore Sun, the Harrisburg Patriot News, and the York Daily Record. He edited national magazines for USA Today Sports and was National Football League editor for USA Today Sports Weekly. He won numerous state, regional, and national writing and editing awards during his career and managed the 32-person copy desk in Harrisburg when the newspaper won a Pulitzer Prize in 2012. Kirkwood is a Michigan native and graduate of Central Michigan University, where he has returned as a guest speaker to journalism classes as part of the school's Hearst Visiting Professional Series. That is a big mouthful for me, Ron, so congratulations on all of that. And I know that you have been a Gettysburg Foundation guide at the George Spangler Farm Civil War Field Hospital site since it opened in 2013. So if anybody's going to know something a little bit about Spangler, I trust it would be you. Today, he lives in York with his wife of 45 years, Miss Barbara. So without further ado, if y'all please welcome Ron Kirkwood.
Thank you, Abby. Some of you might not know that Abby spent a good deal of time working in the Spangler house.
Yes, I did.
For the Gettysburg Foundation, and she did a great job, and we miss her out there. But it's good to see you again, Abby. And the Historical Society was so important for me in preparing this book. I spent a lot of time there at the Wolf House with Tim Smith and Roger Rex, and I will always be grateful for what I learned about the Spanglers at the Wolf House and how they helped me there. So thanks for having me. I'm going to take a second to get my slideshow set up and off we'll go. Okay. I argue in my book, Too Much for Human Endurance, that George and Elizabeth Spangler owned the most important farm in the Army of the Potomac's victory at Gettysburg. So we're going to look at that first. Then we'll discuss the two major hospitals on Spangler property. We'll talk about the Spanglers themselves and the last 3 days of Confederate Brigadier General Lewis Armistead's life, which were spent on the Spanglers farm. So on the map on the left, you can see in dark gray, the Spangler farm in 1863, right behind the Union line. This farm was 166 acres and it dominated the countryside behind the line. It was close to the left flank, as you can see, it was close to the center of the line, and it was close to the right flank of the line. Then there are the roads. Granite Schoolhouse Lane cuts through Spangler as shown by the blue arrow. Blacksmith Shop Road is marked by the blue X's. Both go directly to the battlefield and connect the Baltimore Pike and Tawnytown Road, the two main arteries. With the Spangler farm, Union commanders had the size, the location, and the roads needed to hold massive amounts of infantry and artillery close by in reserve, and they were able to get those reserves to the line quickly and often just in time. This was a farm that could help win a battle. This map shows how the Army used the Spanglers farm. Number 9 on the map shows the main location of the Army of the Potomac Artillery Reserve. And number 4 in the middle of the farm is the site of the 1st Division 2nd Corps Hospital near Granite Schoolhouse, next to Granite Schoolhouse on Spangler land. And we'll get to those two in detail in a moment. Now, most followers of Gettysburg know very well the story of the 20th Maine, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, and the other 5th Corps regiments that famously defended Little Round Top on July 2nd. But what they might not know is that Chamberlain and the rest of the 5th Corps got to the line so quickly because the men spent the afternoon of July 2nd resting on and next to the Spanglers farm, their location shown on the right. And this farm, as I showed on the first map, is right behind the Round Tops. So the 5th Corps was ordered to the line late afternoon, July 2nd. Part of the Corps rushes down Granite Schoolhouse Lane. The other part rushes down Blacksmith Shop Road. The 5th Corps isn't gone long before the 6th Corps moves into that exact same location, and they're not there long before they rush down Granite Schoolhouse Lane to the line. Later on the evening of July 2nd, a division of the 12th Corps leaves Culp's Hill and they rush down Granite Schoolhouse Lane to the line. George Meade had his main street at Gettysburg, and it was a little rutted cow path in the middle of George Spangler's farm that would eventually become named Granite Schoolhouse Lane. So the 11th Corps Hospital, the biggest of the two hospitals, is shown at number 10 on the map. That's around the Spangler's house, farm, other buildings. There were 100 ambulances attached to the 11th Corps, and you can see on the map where they were located at Spangler. And when they weren't at Spangler, they were usually at East Cemetery Hill. A 100 wagon ammunition train accompanied the artillery reserve. This train provided all of the ammunition for all of the artillery of the Army of the Potomac. That's 100 wagons, hundreds of men, hundreds of mules and horses, and you can see their location on the Spangler farm. Several companies of the 4th New Jersey are there to guard that wagon train. There's artillery and infantry on the west side of the farm, and then there's Powers Hill, most of which was owned by George Spangler in 1863. General Slocum sets up his 12th Corps headquarters at the top and the bottom of Powers Hill. He's there from July 1st through the 5th. There's artillery on the hill. There's infantry on the hill. There's a signal station on the hill with their flags waving. And then General Meade uses the hill. He retreats to Powers Hill to watch the end of the battle after being bombed out of the Leicester House. After the battle, he returns to the line, but then his headquarters is set up that night of the 3rd at the base of Powers Hill as shown on the map. And he's there till the thunderstorms washed him out on the 4th. Now there's no sign or marker for Meade's headquarters on Spangler land, but it's in the George Spangler Woods, which is still there right next to the Slocum marker if you want to check out where Meade was after the battle. This photo shows one artillery battery and the men, horses, and wagons required to operate 6 cannons. There were 19 of these artillery reserve batteries crowding and overflowing Spangler land at 2 p.m. on July 2nd. So each of the 7 Union Infantry Corps at Gettysburg had their own artillery batteries, totaling about 200 cannons among the 7 corps. These cannons went where their assigned corps went, but the artillery reserve added 106 cannons, 2,300 men, and 2,300 horses, another whole third of power. Plus, the artillery reserve cannons based at Spangler July 2nd and 3rd didn't have to go where an infantry corps went. These were crucial utility players who could be counted on to perform well and be plugged in anywhere in the line that they were needed. And that's exactly what George Meade and Artillery Chief Henry Hunt did on the last 2 days of the battle. They rushed cannons from Spangler to the line, often with only moments to spare, to prevent a Confederate breakthrough. So artillery reserve batteries left Spangler as shown on the map. They fought at the Peach Orchard, they fought on the Trossel Farm, they fought on the Plum Run line, they left Spangler and they fought at the Cadore Farm, they fought all along Cemetery Ridge, they fought on Cemetery Hill, they fought on East Cemetery Hill, and the artillery reserve even fought on the Spangler's own Powers Hill. Other farms saw a lot more combat than the George Spangler farm at Gettysburg and were literally destroyed by it. But not one single farm played a greater strategic and logistical role with its 2 roads, with Powers Hill, and its in the middle of it all location than the George Spangler farm in setting up the Union victory in the biggest battle of the Civil War. I'm sure most, if not all of you, are familiar with this famous image of the dead horses at the Trossel Farm after the battle. These horses were 9th Massachusetts Battery horses. 9th Massachusetts Battery is the artillery reserve. So that means that these horses spent the day at Spangler before they were rushed out to the line, before they were killed on July 2nd. The 1st Division caught the heaviest of the blow. Many killed and wounded were the result, and the latter were now being brought to the hospital in great numbers. Granite Schoolhouse Hospital Surgeon-in-Chief, Dr. William Warren Potter, 57th, New York. So Granite Schoolhouse was built in the early 1860s when the Spanglers donated the land in the middle of their farm for it. On days 2 and 3 of the battle, there was a major 1st Division 2nd Corps Army of the Potomac Hospital in the fields and woods around the school. This hospital has received little attention since the battle, and little has been revealed about it until my book came out, and I think that's a shame. It's just overgrown, unmarked land now with thorns and poison ivy that make it difficult to enter, as shown in the bottom left photo. But this hospital hosted the 1st Division, 2nd Corps wounded and dying men who fought at Rosewoods and the Wheatfield, 2 crucial places on the battlefield. These were the fighters of the famous Fighting Irish Brigade. This was a division of Father William Corby, who granted the men general absolution moments before the Day 2 battle, thus clearing their path to heaven. This was the Corps of General Hancock. More than 1,000 men of the 1st Division were casualties on just that one day of fighting. And by the end of July 2nd, most of those wounded were either at the 1st Division 2nd Corps Hospital at Granite Schoolhouse on the George Spangler farm, or they were waiting to be taken there. Chaplain John Henry Wilbrand Stuckenberg of Erie and the 145th Pennsylvania served at the Granite Schoolhouse Hospital. He said, "Our hospital was at the foot of Powers Hill. I found the doctors and nurses busily engaged with the wounded, scattered around in all directions, some lying on blankets, some on straw, a few on stretchers, others on the bare ground. Private Erastus Allen of Company G, shot through the abdomen, suffered terribly. Some of the intestines protruded through the wound, and some of their contents would occasionally flow out, producing a horrible stench. It was very evident that our regiment had again suffered severely. Second Corps Ambulance Chief Lieutenant Thomas Livermore of New Hampshire made numerous deliveries to Granite Schoolhouse on July 2nd. He said, "Here under the shelter of some boulders lay a large number of our wounded and dead who had been brought from the field. They lay upon the ground covered with their blankets, and the living were nearly all silent, having fallen asleep from fatigue." Brigadier General Samuel K. Zook was treated at the school on July 2nd for a massive chest wound before dying in a house farther behind the line on July 3rd. His wound opened such a gaping hole that a doctor could see the general's heart beating. The monument on Wheatfield Road at the top left of the page marks where General Zook was mortally wounded. Colonel Edward Cross, 5th New Hampshire, died July 2nd at Granite Schoolhouse after wounded on the opposite side of the Wheatfield from General Zook. Cross Avenue between Devil's Den and the Wheatfield bears his name. Colonel Cross was beloved as a great fighter in New Hampshire and by many of his men, but he was despised by others for his drinking and his temper tantrums. His unit's Pioneer Corps called him a tyrant and refused to bury him in Gettysburg. The monument in the middle of the page is to Cross and his fighters. Then there's Lieutenant George A. Woodruff, 1st United States Artillery Battery I, mortally wounded on July 3rd during Pickett's charge when he was hit in the back while facing and directing his men at Ziegler's Grove. The son of a Michigan judge died at Granite Schoolhouse, telling his friends that he regretted being shot in the back and asking that it should be no reflection upon his reputation. Most of the 1st Division 2nd Corps Hospital at Granite Schoolhouse was moved to safety farther behind the line on day 3 after 24 hours of intense service because it was getting hit by Confederate artillery overshots from the pre-Pickett's charge cannonade. The school building was torn down in 1921. Nothing remains of it today except the foundation of the building, most of which is buried under 100 years of overgrowth. The National Park Service has declared it an archaeological site and does not encourage visitation. This modern photo shows what the unmaintained site of the 1st Division 2nd Corps Hospital looks like today. This was an open field in 1863. This hospital was between the school and Powers Hill, and it was this former field where most of the wounded and dying Union men from the Wheatfield and Rosewood fights lay. This is where Cross and Woodruff died and where Zook was treated before he died. The National Park Service told me it would be too expensive to clean up and maintain and mark this land because it is not part of the battlefield. One day cured me of a hospital. Give me the picket line every time in place of a hospital. Captain Matthew B. Cheney, 154th New York, after visiting the 11th Corps Hospital. The 11th Corps medical staffers picked the Spanglers farm for a hospital on July 1st because of its proximity to the evolving front line, access to water, crops and livestock for food, buildings for hospital purposes, good roads, and wood for operating tables, tents, fires, and caskets. While the 1st Division 2nd Corps Hospital used the school on Spangler land, the 11th Corps Hospital used the Spangler's barn, summer kitchen, house, other outbuildings, and fields. George Spangler was 47 years old. Elizabeth Spangler was 44 during the Battle of Gettysburg. Their children were all living home in 1863. They were 21-year-old Harriet, 19-year-old Sabina, 17-year-old Daniel, 14-year-old Benaiah. The 6 Spanglers are ordered by 11th Corps doctors on July 1st to either leave their farm or stay together out of the way in one upstairs bedroom. So that bedroom is where they lived during the 5 weeks and 2 days that their home was occupied for a hospital. They could leave the room, but in doing so, they had to step over and around wounded and dying Union officers just to get out of their house. So the ambulance corps starts delivering the 11th Corps and other wounded to Spangler at about 4 p.m. on July 1st. At the hospital's peak attendance on July 4th and 5th, both the Christian and Sanitary Commissions estimate there were between 1,900 wounded there. And I believe there were between 50 and 75 Confederates among those 1,900. Dr. Daniel G. Britton, Westchester, Pennsylvania. He said, the wounded soon began to pour in, giving us such sufficient occupation that from the 1st of July till the afternoon of the 5th, I was not absent from the hospital more than once, and then but for an hour or two. Very hard work it was too, and little sleep fell to our share. 4 operating tables were going night and day. Many of them were hurt in the most shocking manner by shells. My experience at Chancellorsville was nothing compared to this, and I never wished to see such another sight. For myself, I think I never was more exhausted. Surgeries, amputations took place here under the forebay of the Spanglers barn. There, doctors could have more light and fresh air away from the smells and crowds inside the barn. Surgeons worked here with their backs to the wall of the barn. A surgeon could finish an amputation in 5 to 15 minutes, depending on the limb, and then they would immediately move on to the next one. No washing required of bloody or germ-infested hands or bloody equipment, because they didn't understand how proper sanitation could prevent infection and reduce the spread of disease. A Spangler surgeon approaching total exhaustion called the work too much for human endurance. Private William Southerton, age 19, 75th Ohio, said, at the doorway, I saw a huge stack of amputated arms and legs, a stack as high as my head, the most horrible thing I ever saw in my life. I wish I had never seen it. I sickened. Amputated limbs were loaded into a wagon and buried somewhere in a distant location on the farm. The amputations and surgeries and wounds attracted an infestation of flies that relentlessly harassed everyone. Pigeons in the barn added to the filth. Hornets added to the pain. Then there were the maggots that covered wounds and stumps. Infections were expected after a Civil War surgery, and the worst infections could be smelled 8 to 10 feet away. So imagine the stench that greeted a hospital staffer or visitor in the barn, or when entering a tent filled with 8 to 10 men, all suffering with infections. To help battle these smells, Spangler hospital workers cut branches off pine trees and hung them on the tents and used them inside for bedding. George Spangler built a classic Pennsylvania bank barn with the 7-foot overhang or forebay on the front that allows for more storage upstairs, and the bank on the back of the barn to allow wagons to be driven right up to the top floor for ease of loading and unloading. This style of barn was brought over by the Swiss and the Germans in the 1700s and 1800s. And as most of you know, you can see them all over the battlefield today. This map is provided on the bottom right by historic Gettysburg, Adams County. And I think that's a wonderful map, and it really shows the main area of the Pennsylvania bank barn. I've seen this style barn many times when I drive out on the turnpike to Pittsburgh. I see it driving down I-81 into Virginia. I've even seen a couple in Ohio. I think it's such a brilliant design. It should be used all across the country, but it was perfect for George Spangler and other farmers in this area. Men were crammed so closely together in the Spangler's barn that it caused the spread of diseases. Some men died of these diseases rather than the battle wound that brought them to the hospital. All of this hospital was horrific. All of this barn was horrific, but it was the worst under the forebay right there where the amputations took place and just inside the front wall in the stable. That's where many of the worst cases awaited their surgery amid cries of agony, smells of infection, body fluids, and human feces. Cries and screams could be heard 50 yards away in the Spanglers' house. Hospital workers covered their head with a pillow at night to try to drown out these sounds. Nurses read scripture and prayed with the men in an attempt to help send them on their way. Outside in the Spangler fields, the Army didn't provide enough hospital tents or bedding or food or clothes for the first several days because Generals Meade and Hancock banned hospital wagons to Westminster, Maryland, to keep the roads clear for fast troop movement. This multiplied the misery of the wounded and dying men at Spangler and other hospitals, who were forced to lie in the mud in the open when the thunderstorms came on July 4th. Corporal William R. Kiefer, Spangler hospital worker from the 153rd Pennsylvania of the Allentown Easton area, said, "Hundreds were lying with but feeble, or in most cases with no shelter, exposed to a cold, incessant rain against the sides of the barn and in an orchard adjoining the sheds. Their moans were heard in every direction, and with a lantern I moved about from one to another during the long hours of the night. I searched in vain for blankets to cover the suffering and dying." Two female nurses played key roles at Spangler. Marilla Hovey and her 17-year-old son Frank traveled with her husband, Dr. Bleecker Lansing Hovey of the 136th New York, and she was always one of the first to reach the hospital during a battle. Sadly, no photos of Mrs. Hovey have been found. The Hoveys are the only surgeon's family known to have traveled together during the Civil War. Mrs. Hovey nursed the wounded, rode home to family members of the dead and the dying. She was able to go into sort of an autopilot mode, look past their terrible wounds and suffering, and hold the hands of dying soldiers and talk to them in a desperate attempt to get their mind off their agony and their situation. In one letter from Spangler, Mrs. Hovey informed the family of their son's death and told them, "I have had a good deal of care of him and called him my soldier boy and tried to take the place of mother, sister, and friend. I think I never had such a trial parting with one that I had no more acquaintance with." The Hoveys worked at the 11th Corps Hospital the entire 5 weeks it was open, then went home to New York for 3 weeks to recover. Nurse Rebecca Lane Pennypacker Price of Phoenixville, near Philadelphia, rode to Gettysburg from Baltimore on a bench in a railroad cattle car in the middle of the night with donations shortly after the battle. Then she went to work as an unpaid nurse at Spangler. She said, "The sad scenes would fill a volume. So many times at night I lay on my stretcher, weeping instead of sleeping." Captain Augustus Vinyos, 107th Ohio, wounded on July 1st on what is now Barlow Knoll. Gangrene developed, and his right arm was amputated above the elbow at Spangler. Mrs. Price nursed him from near death until he was well enough to take a train home to Canton. He went on to marry in 1866, have 9 children, many grandchildren, while amassing substantial wealth as a businessman. He was a pallbearer at the funeral of close friend, President William McKinley. Vinyos carried Mrs. Price's photo for 40 years after the war. He often showed her photo to fellow ex-soldiers at national encampments in an attempt to find her and thank her, but always without luck. But finally, in 1906, he received a letter. "Dear sir, do you remember the tall nurse at Gettysburg who furnished you with clothing so that you could go home?" She had found him. Vinyos replied that he looked forward to seeing her with great pleasure, and their reunion took place at a GAR encampment in New York State in 1906, 43 years after they met at the Spanglers' farm. This is my wife, Barb. She's one of my main research helpers, and we spent a week at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, and we were going through 19 of the filthiest boxes you could see with 1800s dirt and 1800s paper in them. But it was so worth it. We were researching the 154th New York, who had surgeons, hospital workers, wounded and dying men at Spangler, and we found a lot on the 154th. But the bonus and the pure luck for me was these 154th guys were there when General Armistead arrived on July 3rd. And not only were they there, they talked about it and they wrote about it, and their thoughts were recorded in these 19 filthy boxes, which, by the way, once Barb and I left, Cornell just declared these boxes to be hazardous materials, and they're now closed to the public. But because the 154th guys wrote and talked about Armistead, I stumbled into some new materials on Armistead that I can include in my book. So I was extremely grateful to the 154th and extremely lucky that it was in these materials. Confederate Brigadier General Lewis Armistead began the final walk of his life in what would become known as Pickett's Charge on the Seminary Ridge farm of Henry Spangler. He would die 2 days later on the farm of Henry's half-brother, George Spangler. Armistead arrived at George and Elizabeth Spangler's farm at dusk on July 3rd, 1863, according to Dr. Henry Van Arnhem of course, 154th New York. Armistead arrived in an ambulance. He was removed on a stretcher and placed on the ground next to the ambulance and near the Spanglers' barn. The 11th Corps Hospital workers, Private Emery Sweetland and Private Edson Ames, both of the 154th New York, described Armistead's appearance as pretty bloody and covered with blood. Sweetland heard Armistead as he lay on the stretcher say, "You have a man here that is not afraid to die." So the Spanglers' property was a shoulder-to-shoulder mass of chaos, agony, and crying when Armistead arrived. Many wounded from Pickett's charge were pouring in as overwhelmed surgeons desperately tried to find who could be saved with immediate attention. Even so, the arrival of the Confederate general turned heads, and a large crowd of gawkers formed around a stretcher circling Armistead. The crowd was eventually broken up, and Dr. Van Arnhem arrived at Armistead's side and ordered that he be carried away for treatment. Fellow Spangler patient, First Lieutenant T.C. Holland, 28th Virginia, said he and Armistead were placed in the orchard. Lieutenant Holland said at one point under the trees that Armistead asked the doctors and nurses working around him to, "Please don't step so close to me." Dr. Van Arnhem described Armistead as wild, nervous, flighty, saying war must cease, men of same blood, and he could not live. Spangler patient, Private Justice Silliman of the 17th Connecticut, described the 46-year-old Armistead as rather past middle age. Private Sweetland said Armistead had gray hair and whiskers. Dr. J. Kling of the 55th Ohio said Armistead was suffering intense pain induced by the wound. Stimulants and painkillers were immediately given him. Dr. Brinton took time to get to know Armistead, calling him a fine man, intelligent and refined. I had considerable conversation with him and was much pleased with his manners and language. Armistead died July 5th in the summer kitchen, that separate building shown in the photo to the right of the Spangler's house. Army of the Potomac Captain Frederick Stowe, the son of anti-slavery author Harriet Beecher Stowe of Uncle Tom's Cabin fame, was his roommate in the building, which was reserved for those two VIPs. Stowe lived. Armistead's body was wrapped in a blanket, placed in a coffin made of wood from the Spanglers' farm, and buried in their orchard. 1 month later, he was exhumed by an embalmer from Philadelphia who was seeking to make money off his body. So Armistead was dug up after a month in a wood coffin. His body was embalmed in whatever condition it was in, and then reburied. His body was dug up one more time in October when relatives claimed it and reburied him in Old St. Paul's Cemetery in downtown Baltimore. So I have found, confirmed, and listed the names, wound, and treatment of 1,441 Union and Confederate men at the Spangler 11th Corps Hospital, and the names of 141 men who were buried in the Spangler's peach and apple orchards. The Union men were exhumed within a few months after the battle and reburied at Soldiers National Cemetery at Gettysburg. Most Confederates, other than Armistead, lay in Gettysburg until 1872, when they were exhumed and reburied across the South. Armistead is one of 5 Confederates known to have been buried at Spangler. "50-year-old Colonel Eliakim Sherrill, 126th New York, died in the Spanglers' house. His funeral in Geneva drew lines of people that stretched several blocks. His image is on the monument to the 126th New York in Ziegler's Grove. Assistant Surgeon William S. Moore of the 61st Ohio died at Spangler. Amazingly, he was the only Army of the Potomac surgeon or assistant surgeon to die at Gettysburg. He left behind 1-year-old and 2-year-old children, young widow Sarah, who was so torn by grief that she mourned for the rest of her life and never remarried. Colonel Francis Mahler of the 75th Pennsylvania died at the Spangler's house. The Philadelphia City Council honored him with a resolution and paid for his funeral. His brother, 2nd Lieutenant Lewis Mahler, died on the battlefield on July 1st at about the time and place of his brother's mortal wounding. Sergeant Nelson W. Jones, 3rd Maine, 3rd Corps, died at Spangler after being hit in both legs in the peach orchard by an artillery shell. He died even though he made and applied tourniquets to his legs on the battlefield. He was 20 or 21 years old. Private George Nixon of the 73rd Ohio died at Spangler. He would become the great-grandfather of President Richard M. Nixon. George Nixon was 40 years old when he entered the Army as a poor man working on a rented farm. He left behind a wife and 9 children when he went off to war, very likely only enlisting to make money to support his family. His enlistment photo here shows some of the saddest eyes I've seen. Adjutant and First Lieutenant Joseph Heaney, age 21, 157th New York, died of a leg wound at Spangler. Nurse Price walked next to his stretcher and held an umbrella over him to protect him from the July sun as he was taken to the Spangler barn for an amputation. First Lieutenant Thomas Wheeler, 75th Ohio, age 25, spent almost a month at Spangler before he died of 4 wounds. His parents were at his side, and Nurse Price sang Rock of Ages to him as he died. Many soldiers didn't tell the whole story of the seriousness of their wounds in letters home from Spangler because they didn't want their family to worry. Sergeant Henry Seas of the 82nd Ohio wrote to his brother from Spangler, "My leg was amputated just above the knee. I stood the operation very well, being under the influence of chloroform. I am very well cared for and in a fair way to get along well. I hope mother will not worry herself about me." But Sergeant Henry Seas died 1 week after he wrote that letter home. Many died at Spangler as teenagers. 19-year-old drummer Thaddeus Reynolds of the 154th New York was in such agony from lockjaw as he neared death that doctors put him under with chloroform so he could die in peace. One father arrived at Spangler from New York 1 day after his son died. One wife from Ohio arrived a few days after her husband's death. They found out about their loved one's death when they got to Gettysburg. Many died at the 11th Corps Hospital, who were the lone source of income for their sickly parents back home. Corporal Andrew Mayberry of the 20th Maine died at Spangler, leaving behind wife Hannah and 5 children ages 6 months to 11 years. But the vast majority of 11th Corps Hospital patients survived thanks to Civil War medicine. They included Captain Alfred E. Lee of the 82nd Ohio, went home from Spangler with a hip wound. And when he got off the train in his hometown, he found his obituary in the newspaper. He realized that his funeral was going on right then, so he walked in on his funeral. Brigadier General Francis Barlow spent a week at Spangler with 3 wounds that numerous doctors declared to be mortal, but he surprised all of them and lived. It's thought that his wife Arabella attended him at Spangler. Corporal James Brownlee of the 134th New York survived 7 gunshot wounds at the Brickyard on July 1st, one of which broke 4 ribs. He was shot 3 times through the bowels. Private Justice Silliman of the 17th Connecticut was knocked out by a shot to the head on July 1st. He was taken to 3 different Confederate hospitals in Gettysburg before arriving at Spangler on July 4th. He healed and became a nurse at both Spangler and Camp Letterman. He said of the scene at Spangler, the barn more resembled a butcher shop than any other institution. One citizen ongoing near it fainted away and had to be carried off. If you combine the number of wounded at the Granite Schoolhouse Hospital with the number of wounded at the 11th Corps Hospital, the Spanglers hosted almost 3,000 wounded soldiers on their farm, which was more than the entire population of Gettysburg of 2,400 at the time. The surgeons at Spangler were among the best of the best for their time, and they saved far more lives than they lost. Many went on to national leadership roles, but just like the soldiers, these surgeons were taken prisoner, they were wounded, they got sick, and they suffered. Many Spangler surgeons died young because of their exposure to disease, their horrifying work, poor food, long marches, and unsanitary camp life. Spangler surgeon Dr. Henry Van Arnhem of the 154th New York was a passionate opponent of slavery who wanted full civil rights for Blacks. He said, "The curse of God visits on all that come in contact with this atrocious institution." Dr. Van Arnhem served 4 terms as a United States Congressman. Spangler surgeon Dr. Henry K. Neff of the 153rd Pennsylvania was captured at Chancellorsville and held prisoner for 4 weeks, and his health never recovered. He was sick with pneumonia as he cared for others at Spangler, and he remained sick after he was transferred to work at Camp Letterman later in July. He died not long after the war at age 45. Spangler surgeon Dr. J. Kling of the 55th Ohio was captured by Confederate cavalry while on his way home and imprisoned for 3 months after being mustered out in Georgia in 1864. He filed a claim to the government for losses sustained, expenses incurred, but was denied because he was taken prisoner after he was mustered out. The 11th Corps wounded continued to be sent away until the Spanglers finally got their farm back on August 7th, at least what was left of it. George filed 3 damage claims to the state and federal governments, totaling about $5,000, but the Spanglers received only $90, and it's believed that the entire $90 went to their Washington, D.C. attorney. So they got nothing. The U.S. quartermaster's agent said, "The government of the United States is no more responsible for bringing on the battle fought there than it would have been had a tornado passed over that country, causing as widespread destruction as did that terrible engagement. That battle and hospital damage was his misfortune." The top left photo is one of only a few known photos of members of the George Spangler immediate family. And this one is of their youngest son, Benaiah, his wife, Sarah, and daughter, Mary Elizabeth, and was probably taken in 1888 for the 20th anniversary of the battle. Benaiah and his family were living on and running the farm at this point after his parents purchased a smaller farm next door and moved there. This photo does show how well the Spanglers rebuilt their farm after the battle. They even added everything to the left of the porch on the house after the battle. You can see the smokehouse to the left of the house where they salted and smoked and preserved their meats. Their outhouse beyond the fence, that picket fence was common in farms in those days around the yard of the farm. You can see the summer kitchen where Armistead died, with the oven on the outside attached where they would bake their bread. And there's a grape arbor on the front for not only growing grapes, but the Spanglers could sit under it in the shade for doing chores, and other outbuildings that were on the farm at the time. I was thrilled to find the wedding day photo at the top right, the Spanglers' number 3 child, Daniel, and his bride, Effie, even though I found it after my book came out. So now I have photos of Spangler's sons, Daniel and Benaiah, but I'm still looking for their sisters and their parents. The photo at the bottom right is the other known photo. This photo is from 1886 or 1887, is in front of Granite Schoolhouse. and includes 4 members of George's family. This is where Mary Elizabeth attended school on her grandfather's farm, a 1/4 mile walk from the house. Benaiah is at the far left, marked by the blue X. He's in the photo because he was on the township school board. Daughter Mary Elizabeth is marked by the blue star. Clara Patterson is under the arrow, and Alice Patterson is under the oval. They're the daughters of George and Elizabeth's second child, Sabina. Teacher Maggie Schwartz is on the right, looking like she's holding a ruler, most likely for 1800 student control. That's little Raphael Sherfy of the famous peach orchard family in the front center with his dog. Sadly, at this point, Raphael's father had already died, but despite that, Raphael grew up to become a well-known, prominent, and distinguished dentist in the Gettysburg area. George Spangler was chairman of the Cumberland Township School Board when he donated this land for Granite Schoolhouse to be built in 1861. He also was a church and Adams County leader, serving on several boards, including the Evergreen Cemetery Board that voted not to allow Confederate burials there. A teacher whom George hired said, "Mr. Spangler proved himself to be a very efficient school official and made a lasting impression on my mind as a man of truthfulness and honesty in all things." Elizabeth Spangler took care of her widower father in his later years and made sure he was buried next to her and George. The Spanglers also took in a niece after George's sister Susanna died. All 4 Spangler children became productive adults. Harriet and Sabina married local farmers and worked hard and had families, and I can say that their descendants today are absolutely some of the finest people I know. Daniel moved to Kansas to use his carpentry skills in the growing new state and settled near Abilene around the time Marshal Wild Bill Hickok was battling rowdy cowboys there in the early 1870s. Benaiah worked the family farm for many years until he gave up farming and moved into Gettysburg in about 1890. And he lived in the house that is now Mr. G's Ice Cream on Baltimore Street. As was common in families in those days, personal tragedy followed the Spanglers. George's daughter, Harriet, died 2 months after he died. Then Harriet's daughter, Annie, died a few days after her mother. So Elizabeth lost her husband, a daughter, and a granddaughter in a little more than 2 months. One of Daniel's 2 sons drowned in Kansas, and Benaiah's only grandchild died as a toddler. The top photo shows what the barn looked like when the Gettysburg Foundation purchased the property in 2008. The whole place was a mess. The foundation did a complete rebuild to historic detail since then, and now opens the farm to visitors and offers programs and tours on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays in June, July, and early August. The foundation even used horsehair in the mortar as a bonding agent during its rebuild, because that's what was used when the barn was built around 1850. Most of the wood in the modern day barn was there in 1863 and is the same wood that the men lay on and next to. Some of that barn's wood dates to a log cabin barn that was built on the property in the 1700s, which the Spanglers recycled when building this barn. I'd like to close with 2 thoughts from Spangler 11th Corps Hospital worker, Private James R. Middlebrook of the 17th Connecticut. He wrote to his wife, Frances, from Spangler, "It is enough to make one's heart bleed to witness the amputations. I feel it my duty to do all I can for them. I cannot see them suffer and shall stay as long as I can stand it." Private Middlebrook survived until the end of the Civil War, and after nearly 3 years of service and all those battles and all that suffering and all that movement all over the East Coast, it was the fight in Gettysburg and his work in the Spangler Hospital that Middlebrook remembered most in one of his last letters home before being mustered out. "Make up your mind to travel some when we get home," he wrote on July 12, 1865. Excuse me. I think of going to that place long to be remembered, Gettysburg. Adams County, thank you so much for having me here tonight.
Ron, thank you so much. That was a great overview of Spangler. And I know I learned a lot, which is funny because you started with saying I office there, but I learned stuff that I didn't even know about the property, which was I really
Oh, good,
appreciate. And
good.
I
Thank
know
you.
our folks watching tonight really appreciated that as well. So I want to thank you so much for coming on. Any last thoughts for us tonight?
This farm has so many stories to tell, and I'm just so glad and so appreciative of what the foundation has done and having the vision to purchase it in the first place and prevent it from being developed. And now not only did they purchase it, they preserved it, they've rebuilt it, and it's open to the public, like I said, in the summer. And I would just encourage people to get out there and see firsthand where this historic farm is and what all happened there.
Yeah. Thanks, Ron. I can really attest to the fact that y'all do a really good job out there with programming. Our visitors walk away, most of them having spent probably twice or three times as much time as they planned when they get there.
Mhm.
So I am hoping sometime this summer to get out there again myself. So I encourage you folks watching to do the same. I just want to thank y'all so much for joining us again tonight for one of our weekly Thursday night talks with the Adams County Historical Society. Thank you to those who donated tonight. That money will go back toward our program series and help us to keep it all free and accessible. And I just want to thank you again, Ron, lastly, for joining us. And we hope that for those watching, you'll join us again next Thursday for another speaker. I'm sure they'll be just as well as Ron, though I have to say I'm really biased because Ron's a friend of mine. But I just want to thank y'all so much for joining us this evening. Ron, thank you so much.
Thank you, Abby.